we're going to talk about is something I think you'll find very interesting. As fast as the internet changes, there are some realities that have taken a while to get hold, and I want to talk about how the internet has moved from what was at its onset, I think most would agree, a direct response medium, to its growing realization that it can attract a lot of the branding or brand building dollars at the same time. So I've got 4 topics here that I'll run through for you. I want to show you how we moved from the click, although I say that with a little hesitancy because in a recent survey we ran, we found that about 1/3 of advertisers and publishers and agencies are still relying predominantly on the click for evaluating the effectiveness of their campaigns. And I'll show you some evidence that I think will reinforce the conclusion that you've got to be really, really careful with display advertising if that's the metric of choice. I want to show you then how about 5 or 6 years ago, the concept of campaign evaluation and real-time optimization of campaigns emerged, which I think was one of the major step forwards in attracting branding ad money to the internet. The more recent introduction of viewability metrics. For those of you who were able to attend the panel that I moderated this morning, you'll see an elaboration of some of the concepts that we discussed there. And then I want to wrap it up with a discussion of where we think the future is for advertising in the digital world, which obviously is going to encompass cross-platform, and there are some interesting findings already, but a lot of challenges at the same time. Most of the data I'm going to show you, along with Scott, is based upon a variety of comScore databases. So on the left is our panel, 2 million people we track with permission around the world. And they let us put our measurement software on their computer that sends us back in real time everything that computer, everything that it's doing on the internet, including all the products they buy, the videos they see, search queries, et cetera, et cetera. That software monitors and identifies the individual within the household. 60% of users today on the internet around the world are on multiple user machines. The software keeps track of the keystroke, the time between keystrokes, and a digital signature is derived, and that helps us identify Jack from Jill, which is pretty important for advertising measurement. A subset of the panel now has our measurement software on their mobile devices that will encompass both phones and tablets, and all of that person-level data is integrated with feeds that we get from about 1 million domains around the world. It represents about 80% of the top 100 media properties. Integrate the 2 data sets and produce a variety of I think, very valuable information for marketers around the world. That database more recently has been integrated with 5 million set-top boxes of television viewing data. So that's the database that we'll base most of our conclusions and findings on. So let's start with the first step forward in the evolution of the internet, which was moving from clicks to branding. And this is kind of a timeline of the role that comScore has played in it. And I obviously I'm biased towards comScore, but I like to think that we've played a key role in moving the industry forward in a variety of new measurement approaches. So from the introduction of our audience measurement service, Mediametrics, in 2000, 2007, we evaluated and defined the fact that the click is not the right metric for display campaign evaluation. Campaign optimization in 2010, 2011, we got into the viewability measurement with a product called AdExpose, and then more recently rounded that out with validated campaign essentials, and now are building out the future with cross-platform. So that's a history of how we see comScore's role in the digital world. So let's start with the click. And we wrote a paper back in 2009. Actually, I authored this along with a couple of other comScore folks that looked at about 200 different studies of display advertising effectiveness and tried to relate the click rates on those campaigns to the impact of those campaigns measured in terms of sales lift. And we found that even with click rates running at about 0.1%, which is the global average today, so if you look at DoubleClick's ad serving numbers that they publish, 1 in 1,000 ads in a campaign, digital campaign, are clicked on. I'm not talking about search, I'm talking about display. So if you believe that click is the relative metric, you have to then understand how you're going to reconcile these almost 0 click rates to advertising effectiveness. What we found is that even with those click rates being so low, you could still see clearly on most of the campaigns that there was a lift in site visitation, there was a lift in branded search queries, and there was a lift in both online and offline sales. This is just the statistical evidence that there's no R squared of any value if you look at lift and click rate. So the R squared is almost zero. So there's basically statistically saying there's a significant result. The click is not predicting what these campaigns are doing. And when we looked across, I think this is somewhere around 130 or so studies where we're looking at retailers' ability to lift their e-commerce sales and their offline sales using a test versus control design, which has been used obviously for decades, and I think it's extremely reliable. We saw that, again, even with click rates running next to zero, we were getting a lift in e-commerce sales on average of 27% and a lift for offline sales of about 17%. Not surprising that the lift online would be higher. It's working off of a smaller base. But the other finding that was interesting here, beyond saying that the click is not the metric, it's saying that if you're a retailer and on average somewhere around 12% of sales are completed online versus offline, you've got to be really focused on the fact that an online campaign is going to lift your in-store sales as well as your online sales. And that was something that was back, not too long ago, and about 4 years ago, was something that a lot of retailers didn't really understand. They were looking at digital advertising as being related to e-commerce sales. Maybe the siloed structure organizationally of a lot of retailers was helping drive that. But this, I think, kind of opened people's eyes to the importance of digital advertising and the key way in which you should measure it. Okay, the next thing that happened is that I got a phone call. I got a phone call from the digital head at one of the largest global advertisers. And he said, Jan, we have a little problem that you might be able to help us with. We've started moving some of our branding ad dollars online, and our senior executives were shocked to find that there was no audience guarantee the way that there was in the television world. All right? So he's talking about branding advertising, not direct response, branding advertising, and the issue of whether or not what they were buying was really reaching the people that were intended. So he had a suggestion. He said, we'll tag 8 of our campaigns. Would you measure where those ads or those impressions fall within your panel? We said yes, and off we went. And I think this was the first campaign evaluation at this level of granularity. And this is what we found, and the results weren't very pretty. So here are 8 campaigns, and this is looking at the distribution of the impressions as to how they fell. Did they hit the right target, which is the green bar, the right target with the right frequency? The frequency was supposed to be capped at 4. The next orange block tells you whether the ads were in the right geography, but did they hit the target? And that big orange block says they in the right geography, but didn't hit the right demo target. The blue is where it hit the right target, but with a frequency that was too high. And then at the bottom are the impressions that weren't even delivered in the US, which was a problem because none of these products were available outside of the US. And so in the first one, 50% of these impressions were completely wasted. And these weren't small campaigns, as you can see by the data on the left. We're talking about campaigns up to $2 million in cost. And you'd have to conclude that half of those impressions on that first campaign were completely wasted in the wrong geography. So this led us to then try to peel back the onion, if you will, to try to understand what are the drivers of the problems. Some of it was simple human error. So this 50% error, when we looked at it, was simply the result of the large publisher that was running a lot of the impressions in that campaign. The answer was, oh, Frank forgot to switch on the IP address parsing switch that was supposed to cut out all these impressions going outside. So that was human error. But there were other errors that were not so easy to correct. Let me show you what they were. And the conclusion here is that today's delivery systems for digital ads, which for the most part are cookie-based on the desktop, mobile maybe will be the solution, because I think there you've got a much more person-to-person targeting that's happening more accurately. But here's why demographic targeting doesn't work as well as one would like. The demo data attached to a cookie becomes outdated. This is the biggest issue. More than 60% of the users on computers around the world are on multiple user computers, and the cookie is a browser identification and doesn't tell you who is on the machine at any point in time. That's a problem. Another one is that even if you have registration data, was the registration data input correctly? Age is usually the one that tends to have a problem associated with it. And then you've got some targeting information that infers demography from type of content that's consumed, and that's also subject to error. So if you put it all together, you have issues that need to be addressed. We've now measured around the world, this is US data, desktop again, the percentage of impressions across billions of impressions, hundreds of campaigns that are reaching the right demographic segment identified by the vertical industry that the advertiser is in. On average, 44% accuracy, so that slightly more than a half of all of the ad impressions are delivered to desktops don't hit the right demo target. That's, you know, you can look at that and say, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? I would argue that's a lot better than traditional media. It's just that I think the advertiser needs to understand when they're making their buy what the reality is that they're going to get. It can be improved, but it's not as bad as one might conclude, you know, at face value, if you will. The variation across these industries can be traced back to a number of factors. One of them is that the narrower the demographic target that you are trying to reach, the greater the error level. The broader the target, the less the error level. And that's why for computer technology and telecom, they are generally very broad campaigns demographically defined, so their in-target rate is higher, whereas CPG can get hung up on gender and narrow age breaks, and the error level there is going to be higher. So this was one of the first findings. The other one that was very tricky is cookie deletion. All right? Now, how many people delete their cookies off of their computers in a month? All right? The global average runs around 30%, a little variance country to country. But there are two types of cookies, right? There's the first-party cookie, which is the website cookie, and then the ad server cookie. The ad server cookie gets deleted by more people because it has less value than, you know, a cookie that's a registration-based cookie for a website. And it gets deleted frequently. And the combination of those two issues is what causes the problem. So basically, if you look across just a few of the countries I've listed here, you've got somewhere around 35% or so of cookies that are put on by the ad server are deleted in a month, and the deletion rate runs anywhere from 5 to 7 times in a month. And that causes the problem with the frequency capping. The ad server sees a machine, puts an ad on it, the cookie's deleted, it sees the machine again, puts another ad on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it builds the frequency levels up way higher than were intended. How does one solve that problem? Well, one approach is shown here, and I'm able to show you these numbers and identify this as a Kellogg's campaign, thanks to their giving me permission to show you this. This is, think of this as a dashboard that we at comScore provide that's measuring, it's not yet real time. There is, maybe a delay of several days here in providing this information, but it comes back very, very fast. It will be real time in a second, and Scott's going to tell you how that's going to be done. But what this is showing is, by publisher, what the frequency levels are. So in other words, how many impressions per person were delivered, what percentage of the impressions were in target, and then, just so happens for this particular metric, what was the lift in awareness? That's a survey-based measure that for this particular campaign for Kellogg's was important. That's one of the performance metrics they wanted. And then the CPMs, the cost per thousand, shown on the right. The color coding is relevant because the color coding with green and red is, as you might imagine, green is okay and red is a problem. All right? And the way then that these data are used is that the agency would look at where things are not getting delivered the way that they were intended, or where the performance of the campaign measured by a particular metric is not according to what would be needed. So here, I'll just read through a couple. Publisher number 2, the awareness lift is really low, and the CPMs are really high, and the targeting accuracy at 16.9% is low. All right? The publisher at the bottom, the frequency is way too high. There's absolutely no lift in awareness. I'm paying a lot of money for the ads. And so getting this information before the campaign is finished, before the money is spent, at which point it would be, you just have no chance of addressing the issue. If you get it fast enough, you can negotiate with a publisher or move your money around. And in this particular case, what would happen is that unless Publisher 2 and then Publisher 3 could address the issue, money would flow more towards Publisher 1 and away from Publisher 2 or 3, which would result in the campaign delivery being closer to what was intended. It's not, I don't think anybody's come up with a solution that guarantees you that you'll get what you want yet. Talk a little bit about that more in a second. But these data are certainly helping significantly the advertiser improve the delivery. So here is the results of market mix models that Kellogg's run showing the financial ROI from their campaigns for 2 brands since they started doing this in-flight optimization, an improvement of 5 times on one brand, 6 times on another, massive improvements, massive increases in ROI. So we're pretty sure at this point that this is working well for the advertisers and getting very positive reaction from the publishers at the same time. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to take you through viewability, and then I'll be back.
So I think what we've talked about so far is a little bit of the evolution from the beginning. I want to talk a little bit now about where we are today. And we're in the midst of a pretty disruptive time in terms of how new metrics are coming into play, especially around viewability. Now, many of you here will be familiar with the 3MS initiative that was brought together by the IAB, the Advertiser Agents Association, as well as the Agency Association in the US. And really, the mandate there was to try to improve the value of the digital media to people who are concerned about brand advertising. And one way of doing that was through improving the reporting of ad exposure and bolster the confidence in ads that are actually being seen. So us at comScore, we leverage the accepted IAB standard of 50% of the display pixels for greater than 1 second. Still talk around the outstanding definition around viewability, but bringing viewability into the lexicon and the conversations around digital trading has been quite disruptive. We know that last week, the MRC, who has been working with the 3MS initiative to come up with what that standard of definition looks like, has lifted their advisory against using viewability as a trading metric. Later on this week in London, there's a cross-industry group with the IAB that's going to be discussing how that looks like in that market. And we're involved with other conversations in markets from Mexico to Australia to Germany about these same types of deals of bringing in this new type of metric in being able to provide a more accurate and a more meaningful metric into understanding the efficacy of campaign and impression delivery. Across the board, though, and Jan spoke to one of these, there's really 4 key aspects that's sort of holding back, I would say, the ability of digital media to start to capture more of those brand dollars, pounds, or euros. So we talked about the targeting accuracy. There is brand safety, there's fraud, and there's viewability. I could nerd out and speak at great length about all of these, but you'll be fortunate that we've got only a little bit of time, so I'm going to focus just on the viewability. And we need to realize that much like in target delivery, we will never get to a point where there's going to be 100% across the board display ads that are in view. And that's largely for 3 reasons. So the first one is just the user interaction on the page, that they actually leave the page before that minimum requirement of that definition. So again, 50% of the display pixels, 1 second or greater. User's browser isn't on the full screen setting, so there's some minimization that's happening in there, so the full pixels cannot be propagated. And I think more importantly is looking at the bad players out there and the amount of non-human traffic that is actually driving a lot of the impressions that are being served, to the point where a significant amount of inventory is being recorded as unviewable. Now, the win-win here is that by optimizing against low viewability, you're actually taking care of some of the non-human traffic, because we have seen that there is a very strong negative correlation between the levels of viewability and non-human traffic. The higher the viewability rate, the lower the non-human traffic composition looks like. So from the thousands of campaigns that we've been doing globally, we are actually seeing that from a holistic view, premium sites are actually delivering a higher viewability rate than what we are seeing with networks and exchanges. But that's not the full story, because much like Jan just demonstrated from a in-target accuracy, when we look at a viewability, we see that there is differences in what that normative data looks like by the types of advertiser categories that are out there. So just to call on one in the brief amount of time that we have left, if you see health and wellness there, sort of 48%, 2 points higher than the norm, a lot of that has to deal with the fact of the strict regulatory guidelines around pharma advertising in the US and direct-to-consumer. So they typically will be in more safer environments. But what's really important to brands like Kellogg's and other clients that we work with is there's a huge return in terms of offline sales when you start to optimize against viewability. In the case in Kellogg's, we actually see it's not a linear connection between the rise in the overall percentage of viewability that you can get through the campaign. We see in this example, a 40% increase over time on viewability has led to a 75% increase in online sales. So again, we're taking metrics now that are driving direct, meaningful metrics to the businesses of the folks that either you work for or that we work to support. And now when we start to look at that scorecard that Jan had talked about, we can now start to layer in a new column of in-view, and that same type of optimization can happen, but within the in-view, it is a much more granular, a much more time-sensitive view that you can start to do more real-time optimization and doing course corrections whilst that campaign is in flight to start to mitigate against some of the issues, say, around non-human traffic, but also understanding what that increase in offline sales lift is a result of actually driving higher viewability rates. It's disruptive, and the large networks out there are taking up on the opportunities to provide their clients with incremental value to what's going on. And we're lucky here in Italy to have just recently signed an agreement with Group M to really help validate the work that they're doing along the lines of providing the best possible campaign results for their clients. And whether you're running campaigns or being based in either Turin or Tokyo or Toronto, which is near and dear to me, there is an increasing need of global consistency and continuity between how we are approaching the measurement of these brands. And finally, what we start to look at is increasingly large partnerships are starting to come into play. We recently announced a partnership with Google, arguably 2/3 of the ad trafficking that's happening right now, which will provide clients really 3 essential benefits. So one is just going to be the ability to get a cross-media metric in play. It's going to provide really easy access through a click of a tick of a box. And really, it's going to provide actionability because, again, it's getting more into that real-time ability to do those course corrections and those optimizations as required. I'm just going to leave you on one last slide here. I think in the whole discussion around viewability in this disruptive nature, there has been one sort of pillar within the ecosystem that has been probably the most sensitive or the ones that felt potentially the most at risk, and that was publishers and media owners out there. And really what we believe here is that there is just an equal opportunity to take advantage of things like viewability and being able to demonstrate the value of that inventory, not only from a viewability, but in terms of engagement and in some cases what that audience composition looks like. And whether that's through using our campaign effectiveness product or using what we're now rolling out for our publishers, which is the Validated Media Essentials, there is an opportunity right now to take advantage of the disruption and make sure that you're actually ahead of the curve as opposed to following and not being able to leverage the tools that are at all our disposal. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jan.
So I'm going to take 2 minutes to wrap up here. I just want to show you a couple of slides to reinforce the importance of this cross-platform emergence that has been talked about a lot here at this conference. But I just want to show you some actual data, okay? This is US data. We're now doing this measurement in about 5 countries and rolling out to more. More than half of all the time spent on the internet is now on mobile devices. But lest you think that this is the death of the desktop, which was mentioned a couple of times, I have a different view. Because if you look at the way that time spent has changed over the past 3 years, time spent on the internet in the US has doubled, driven by growth in phones and tablets. But in total, there's no evidence that the desktop time spent has declined. That's a really important point to understand and not to conclude from the share numbers that that's all negative for desktop. But be careful about the type of content that's being consumed. I've got 2 examples of extremes. Sports, which is the most heavily consumed content across platforms. The more devices you give somebody, you'll see in a second, the more time spent on sports content. But look at what happened to weather. You have a mobile device, you go off and you use that instead of going off and using a desktop. Same thing happens with maps. It used to be you'd print out a map before you went off on a trip. Now with a phone, you just have map functionality on the phone. Major changes, so be aware of what type of content you're using to deliver your campaigns. Look at this. We did this study for NBC around the London Olympics, and they wanted to understand, among other things, how was multi-platform consumption of sports content changing as more devices were used. The fundamental idea here was there was a 17-day period that the London Olympics took place in, all right? So much content was produced. So much of that content was viewed across multiple devices. If you could measure it, you would open a window into the future of what multi-platform consumption would be. So one slide, just show you one slide. This is the total amount of time spent by platform according to whether the household or the viewer had multiple devices. I'm just going to build this from left to right. That's the total amount of time spent if you person only had a television. You give them a computer, time spent goes up. Give them a computer and give them a phone, it goes up even more. Give them a tablet, and it jumps dramatically. It's not a zero-sum game, at least for sports content, which is great news, I think, for publishers, great news for advertisers. We have extended that, that basic measurement system that we built out for NBC 2 years ago that was small in scale, have now built it out at scale using literally millions of people, millions of set-top boxes, et cetera, et cetera. I won't get into the methodology, but we've built and delivered the first 5-platform measurement system in the world. So if I take then what we've shown you today and kind of sum it up into 5 key takeaways, it's pretty clear that moving from clicks to viewability has boosted the value of publishers' advertising. It's opened up the opportunity to pull in branding dollars that you couldn't get in the direct response world. All right? The in-flight campaign optimization of viewability, targeting, and frequency is being demanded by the advertisers, and I don't think there's any question it promises to accelerate the movement of these dollars into digital. So it's very much a positive. That like any big change, there are some disruptions that need to be worked through. But it's pretty clear that the industry is well on its way to having this be the standard way that campaigns are evaluated. We do think that the publishers' CPMs, the prices they can get for guaranteed viewable impressions, will rise. Maybe it's not happening right away, but I have no doubt that when more advertisers see the kind of results that Kellogg's was getting, that Scott showed you, that will happen. We are working with our 2 key products here, VCE and VME, to provide the tools that are necessary for both the publishers and the advertisers to capitalize on these changes. And bottom line, let's stay really close to what's needed here in a multi-platform world. The measurement systems that are going to be needed to measure multiple platforms will look nothing like the small sample systems that have been used to measure legacy media. You can't do it at scale without just dramatically changing the methodology. So those are the takeaways. So thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.